Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be.
That's right, everybody. The situation is well in hand with Mighty Mouse. Those of you listening to the podcast don't get to hear that bumper music, but I can safely say we're probably the only one that was playing the theme from the Mighty Mouse cartoon years ago as an intro. But it seems so appropriate. We have, very strange people saying they're going to rescue us. Now, we know what Donald Trump has done. He did some pretty good things. The rest of them, it's a bit hazy. So you work right here with Rick Wagner here on Getting It Right with Rick Wagner on KNZZ KGLN on the internet and on our podcast. And we appreciate your listenership. Quite a bit, as a matter of fact. I really do. So here we are, another week and another surreal kind of experience, isn't it? Does anything happen anymore without making you feel like you're living in the Twilight Zone? I mean, I played that bumper music last week for the Twilight Zone, and I think that it's probably appropriate to listen to every day. Also, now we've had an opportunity to see the Democrat National Convention, and it was terrible. Now I know everybody on the commentators, they had made some great speeches and this and that. I heard a couple of them that weren't too bad. The thing about the convention, because we DVR'd some of it so I could jump around on it, because after all, even I can't stand that kind of assault to my frontal lobe, was that a couple of the speeches that were given by people that were pretty good, I didn't expect it. Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, yes, the second gentleman, gave not a good speech like you and I would say, well, we got a lot of information, but it was well delivered and managed to talk around everything about Kamala except his and her interactions. Okay? Pretty much everybody that took the stage were very vague about Harris's thinking on projects. And we may be stretching the term thinking a little hard anyway. But they were very wildly popular with her, or about her, I guess, and her zeal. Her campaign is about joy, folks. Joy, 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 joy. I'm not exactly sure what kind of policy that is. I don't know how that affects, say, North Korea, for instance, but that's the theme. Oh, that, and they don't like the orange man. They don't like Trump because he wants to demagogue, despite the fact that they spent 4 days with nothing but outrageous demagoguing going on. Now, all politicians demagogue a little bit, and certainly they did at the Republican convention. But this one, that's all it was. There was no real meat on the bone on that thing. Very little. I mean, it was the same stuff. I mean, you get the whiff of it's all about race and abortion and you name it. I mean, remember, this is a place that has a huge inflatable IUD out in front of it while they're having the convention, and they have some, other treatments, shall we say, that they're letting people get as sort of a statement. I don't even want to talk about what they were, but that's their platform is just a hazy rendering of the United States as a sort of dark vision of Mississippi in 1951, maybe, or maybe 1870. It's hard to say. That's part of their edition. And the other part is to just sort of fictionalize the Supreme Court ruling on Dobbs about the abortion being turned back to the states. They don't like that. And yet they love the will of the people. Except they don't want the people to have a real say. The people they want to have a say are people in Washington, preferably a few justices on the Supreme Court, so they don't have to worry about selling it to anybody else. Now, moving these kinds of decisions back to the people is what we call federalism. I mean, if states don't have a right to decide something about what they do, then they're not really states, are they? They're just sort of places. Places that the overarching federal government just, visits once in a while, and random lines are drawn, and they call them different names. But if they don't have any ability to do things differently, or have their citizens decide a number of things about how they want to live in that area, then the whole federalism state thing just doesn't do any good. And what's funny is that if you look to the west, to the Golden State, or anymore, I'm afraid we could call it the worn brass state, perhaps. They're fine with federalism. You betcha. They want to do whatever they want to do. Want to ignore federal law? You betcha. Want to not just ignore federal law, but make up your own stuff? Yeah, go ahead. You want to do all sorts of things that essentially are a problem for the rest of the country? Yeah, why not? And so they're not really on board with the rest of the country. Now, they might be on board with some people in Oregon and along Seattle, Washington area up there, and various places like that. And of course, the Eastern Seaboard. Yeah, probably to the Panhandle of Florida, mostly. At any rate, you look at them and you say, what is this stuff about? On one hand, you want to be able to do whatever you want as a state, but you don't want other states to be able to do what they want. I know it's pretty simplistic, but that's kind of what they're doing. That's kind of their position. California ought to be able to be a sanctuary state. It ought to be able to have its own outrageous gun laws. It ought to be able to provide free health care on the back of the taxpayers out there for people who aren't supposed to be in the country at all and are actually breaking federal law when they're here. They want to do all these things, but they don't want to give the chance of any other state to vote for something that they may or may not agree with how that state decides. It's really kind of hypocritical in that way that I'm afraid we've gotten too used to it. We're very used to hypocrisy these days, folks, and I don't think that's good. I mean, we're always a little jaded, and it pays to be a little jaded, but we see so much of it now that it almost doesn't affect us. I mean, look at that convention. Here's kind of a question we sort of frame around an old idea or aphorism. If something happens at the Democrat convention outside and it doesn't get reported, did it actually happen? Interesting question. It apparently doesn't actually happen to people who are watching the convention on MSNBC. It doesn't have any reality for them. There was quite a lot of rioting, quite a lot of things going on outside. Now, this was in 1968, but it was pretty interesting, and it just flat wasn't covered. Fox covered it a little bit. Some of the other sort of more conservatives covered a little bit. The others, no. Matter of fact, there wasn't a whole lot of what was going on outside the building at all, because, of course, it was a circus, and not an attractive circus. So there wasn't anything like that. This is what's happening in our country, folks, is that things are just ignored as though they have no effect if we don't talk about them. And we don't talk about them because nobody tells us about them. That's the theory there. If we don't get riled up, then we can't do anything about it. The whole idea, when someone says they're a journalist at some of these places, I don't know what journalism means anymore, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean recreating, ignoring, rewriting what's going on, just completely turning what's happening in the world into some sort of hazy dream, their hazy dream, and ignoring other things. That's kind of where we're at. Now we've sort of arrived at the age of the Soviet Union, where people who were listening to the news from Pravda, TASS, were more interested in what they could not, my phone's going off there, what they weren't hearing than what they were. So, because they knew that there were things going on out there that they're not being told, and because of that, they tried to read into it what was the rest of it. what's really happening. We'll be right back. Okay, folks, we're back. Rick Wagner getting it right here on Kansas City KGLN and a few other places. Appreciate your... Oh, by the way, you can pick up a lot of these stories we talk about by going back to our website, therickwagnershow.com, or some of you have the old address, which is thewaronwrong.com. Both of them will get you there. And we have a lot of these stories posted and a whole lot of links to websites and so forth, so you don't have to hunt around on the internet so much. So feel free to visit there. And you can also get the podcast there, which is essentially the show put together. And if you've missed one, you can go there and listen to it a little bit. And there's other places too. I think we're on Spotify and TuneIn and probably your Alexa app. It's listening to you all the time anyway, so why not take advantage of that? We appreciate it. Going out there, giving us a little attention, makes us feel wanted. So, RFK Jr., Bobby Jr., as you know by now, because you people are much more informed than the regular people do, has dropped out of the race. Well, he's really been driven out of the race. Come on. The Democrats have pretty much declared war on RFK Jr. All across these United States. They have done everything in their power to get RFK either off the ballot or not get him on the ballot. And they've also done the same thing to Jill Stein. Remember Jill Stein, who was, out there in 2016. She was a candidate as, I can't remember what her party is, Green Party, Yellow Party, Purple Party, I don't know. But anyway, they've managed to keep her off everything, too, because they don't want anybody out there, and third parties. So RFK's been having some trouble getting on the ballot a lot of places. He's been sued about it. He's been, it's a fight. And, it's something that we forget, that these lawsuits that these guys can bring against these campaigns, they're expensive. So the people bringing them have to have some money, and the Democrats do. They have people with a lot of money that are supporting them. And you can take a smaller campaign like something for RFK, and you can just flat run out of money. You can take the fight right out of it. So he has decided to drop out and, interestingly enough, endorse Donald Trump. Now, first off, let's remember, RFK Jr. is not a conservative. He's not a libertarian. Listen to all of his positions. He has some positions that we can agree with. But that's sort of like the old days. Hubert Humphrey had some positions we could agree with. And if he would have dropped out of a campaign for president, we would probably back then said, great, we can agree on some of these things. Maybe we'll give you a job later on. I don't know. Something around here, sweeping up, I don't know. But, not anymore. I mean, RFK probably can be utilized in some position. And don't think he's not trying to buy some influence into the Trump campaign by doing this. And he probably is going to get some. But he has to be used very carefully. Because some of his ideas are pretty far out there. And others, they're in line. It's like I said, it's kind of like the old days, You agree with us 20%, you want to come on board, fine. We'll let you come on board with just your nose in the tent, but please don't bring the rest of the camel with you. So that's what we have here with RFK Jr. But he really got hammered by the Dems. I mean, it's funny, he's an actual Kennedy. And they love RFK. They actually love RFK now, Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy, more than they like John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Because there's more sound bites and things about JFK now, about taxes, and about freedom. I mean, he couldn't get nomination from the Democrats right now. If he was running senator with his viewpoints as a Democrat, no way. I mean, he's more of a middle road Republican right now than a Democrat. Certainly not progressive. And a lot of his, his feelings on taxes and that, a rising tide raises all boats, all that kind of stuff. The left hates that. So RFK, that didn't really come across all that much stuff. I mean, he may have felt somewhat like that, but his was a lot more touchy-feely. And so they're okay with him. But his kid, dude, not so fast. And so he's trying to get involved. RFK Jr. is trying to get involved in this process to become a nominee. Except that there is no process for him to become a nominee. There is no process at all what they did with Kamala Harris. They just did it. It's pretty interesting. They had a virtual convention, and then for some obscure reason, they decided to have a real convention. In other words, at least where people showed up. Everything was already done. There was absolutely nothing going to be a surprise there. Now, I know most of them are like that here in the last 20 years. And we all can remember, if we're over 40 years old, that the conventions used to have there used to be some drama. I mean, in the old days, before that even, there was some drama about who might be the presidential candidate because they were still voting at those conventions in the 60s and whatnot, 50s, 60s. And then it sort of slid into policies and platforms, and that was still kind of interesting, fighting about platforms, fighting about policies. And oftentimes, they were trying to take the temperature of people about who might be the vice president. Not here. This whole thing was decided by a very small group of people. And then it was handed to their constituents out there, the DNC, and they just had to go crazy over it. That was their job, nothing else. Don't ask any questions. Don't see what anybody stands for. Don't look back at any of their record. Just wave signs and scream hard. That's what we got. And so what we have now is really the most liberal ticket, no, not liberal, progressive ticket we've probably ever had in the United States. Walz is the most wide-eyed progressive out there since Eugene V. Debs ran for president when he got locked up during the labor movements in the 30s. So, what do you do with that? Well, what you do is you don't talk about what you believe. You talk about just the other side, and you talk about some of the most vague principles anybody will ever hear. If you had the time, and I don't know if someone wants to waste it that way, but to listen to Kamala Harris' speech. Now, first, it was written very carefully, and she has obviously practiced it several times. There was no giggling, no off-script, no looking off into the ether, and nothing. So she delivered it fine. I mean, it was a little too bouncy for my tastes. Some sort of political speeches should have some substance. Feel like you're talking about something. Not like somebody's officiating a child's birthday party, but that's kind of how it felt. And so if you listen to that, you realize they're not going to talk about anything. They're going to talk about how bad Trump was. They're going to make up a few things. And this is sort of that we were talking about in the first segment, is if I say a bunch of things that make up a story that isn't true, I mean, is that even really a lie? Yeah, kind of. But I mean, they've not even got to the black and white area there. They just made up things whole cloth. They made up sort of a whole new story about her, about what's going on, about where the country's at, everything. They can do that because nobody asks them any questions. Now, to be fair, you don't get to ask people questions when they won't let you. And they won't let them. What is this, like 35 days, I think, today, that she hasn't pulled any kind of real press conference. I mean, she's not even doing anything when they shout questions at her as she goes to a helicopter. Nothing. They don't trust her to say anything. The only thing she was allowed to say was very carefully written all over the teleprompter, and she had practiced it several times before she came out. This is different than what she usually does, because as you know, if you look at what she does with staff and how she runs her, let's say, office, if there's office of the vice president, and was the attorney general's office and the district attorney's office, is she does not want any kind of briefing. She doesn't want to put any time in. She doesn't want to understand anything. She wants to go out and just talk off the top of her head about some things that she's never really thought about before or studied or anything. And then when it, comes back to bite her, she goes back and screams at staff for not preparing her. Apparently, preparing her in her mind is somehow transmitting what she needs to know to her from a great distance. She's not even knowing it. It's sort of an osmosis kind of thing. So same way that flowers, get photosynthesis, that's how she thinks that her information should be stored. With nothing on her part. It just kind of flows in there. And that doesn't happen, and of course it never happens. She doesn't like it. And so what they do is they finally convince her, look, you cannot have a screw-up out here. Not after we've had old Joe wandering around out here screaming at people and then pushed him out of the way. We'll talk about that later. So you have to come out and sound like you're at least coherent. The bar was pretty low, right? No wandering off, no whispering, no shouting, meaningless syllables, no staring off into space for long periods of time. If you can just get past that, for instance, you're way ahead. And if you don't mangle the words into what we all call a word salad, where you take 2 or 3 sentences and just keep repeating them over and over again, like one sentence somehow is dressing up the second one, right? Like, well, let me add some adjectives to the first sentence, and then you'll understand better that I don't know what the third sentence is going to be. So we'll just talk about these two. I mean, that's usually what she does. She gets 2 or 3 words and a concept, and she repeats it 2 or 3 different ways, and she thinks she somehow explained that to her. Well, they knew they couldn't do that. So this is what they did. Hi, folks. Welcome back. Rick Wagner here, getting it right on KNZ KGLN. It's 1100 and 980, and a lot of other places on internet and whatnot, and some translators, and I think we bounce it off the moon, but I'm not exactly sure. Speaking of the moon, by the way, not to go too far off topic, the Chinese have sent another lunar lander they're going to try and send up there. I don't know why we're not paying attention to this. They're going to build a base on the moon. They're going to build it on the southern pole, where they think there might be water that can be extracted from under the surface, essentially from the rock. That's what they're sending this lunar lander for again, to scoop something up and bring it back. They've already done that once. In the meantime, we've pretty much just been decided how to design pregnancy flight suits, and they're going to build a base on the moon. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, there was a time when we would be kind of worried about that. I mean, like I said, it doesn't take a genius in military tactics to know that you want the high ground. And I'm not aware of any higher ground than the moon right now. Well, you could be on Mars, I guess, but it takes a long time to get anything here. The moon's really a good place because you can just sort of just fire stuff off of it. And, low gravity. You can keep an eye on the Earth from where you're at. It's, it's nice. Probably vacations hotspot will become that. We don't seem to care anymore. We don't care for leading in science. We don't care for we don't care for leading in anything. What we want, I guess that's not true. What we want to lead in is just the crazy. And we managed to even do that. We have some of this, like with gender-affirming care and so forth, that we're further ahead than the nut jobs in Europe, further ahead than the French. And the Italian government's actually sort of making sense now. Does that kind of, make your head spin? Britain is headed towards becoming an Islamic country, and that's pretty much Europe. And Germany is trying to figure out how it can just not make Russia any more mad and go on about their business and not spend all of their money in the Ukraine, which makes, but again, Russia mad. They're not seeing what's going on here. Now, this big push by the Ukrainians, by the way, into Russia is very brave, and it's meant to show people that, hey, look, we really are doing something here. Well, that's true. But doing something isn't always necessarily the right thing. Pushing into the Soviet Union, I've been reading some of the stuff out of the Soviet Union, and they're using this. First of all, yeah, there's some people in Russia that are getting tired of this war. But they're using this to talk about, now this is an attack on Mother Russia. See, we've been telling you all the time that Ukraine was a danger to us, and now they're proving it. People can be told that, and of course they shape the news pretty effectively over there. So that's what's happening. And then they can get people riled up. Mother Russia is something they defend. They've always been very tough on their own ground, and not so much when they're off of it. They don't have quite the same esprit de corps, let's say, when they're not fighting on Russian soil or pretty near it. But at any rate, so they're whipping that up, and they do have a lot more reserves and everything. And you have to be a little careful, just as a tactical military maneuver, when you're pushing into such a vast country as Russia. As we know, the Germans tried to do it in World War II by having a huge front, the Eastern Front, one of the longest battle lines in history. Because what they didn't want to do and I wonder about this because this appears to be what Zelensky is doing. They didn't want to make a probe into Russia and then have their flanks cut off and then their supply lines disrupted. I mean, that kind of tactics is as old as people with sharp sticks, which is, you overextend yourself, your flanks are vulnerable, they crush your flanks, cut you off, and essentially surround you. Then you have trouble either getting away, going back where you came, or you have a lot of trouble immediately being supplied. You have problems with little things like starving, not having any bullets, things that can, really make it hard to keep the army going. So we'll see what goes. They have to be careful about extending this in there, assuming the Russians let them extend it in here, if they don't get pushed back real soon. They're going to be out there to do what? That's the question. Nobody seems to want to answer that. This is a show. This is a show that they can do something, get attention, when the world's sort of like thinking maybe we shouldn't spend so much money on this. That's why they're doing it. But that's not a very good reason to have a lot of your forces put in extreme danger, and they are. They're not going to. What are they doing? Right? I mean, originally the idea has been that you go into Russia to disrupt their supply lines and hit some of the missile bases and so forth that have been shooting into Ukraine. Okay. They've really done a little bit more than that. But they're not going to hold on to any Russian territory. You think they're going to annex a part of Russia back into the Ukraine? That's not going to happen. They couldn't do it if they wanted to. They don't have the reach. And it would just be, oh man, I can't even believe that right now, the way they're doing it, that would be their point. And they're not. They're smart enough to know that's not what to do. But they want to make a point and then get back. So we'll see how that turns out for them. We'll see if the world looks at it the same way. I think the Germans are a little nervous about what's happening because Russians are pounding this in that they're invading Mother Russia and we have to stop them, and who knows where that goes. It's like last week we talked about, remember the Russians? We did. I don't think we do anymore. They have some very small tactical nukes, artillery shells essentially, very low yield, half a kiloton, stuff like that, nuclear weapons, but still extremely powerful and would work very well against armored columns and things like that. Say nothing about the fact that they've developed these hypersonic missiles, which we're still behind on. The hypersonic missile is a danger to especially the Navy in the Black Sea. Now, let's not forget, the United States is a naval power. It has to be a naval power. We're an island over here from, everybody else, people we normally trade with and so forth. We're a great big island, but we're still cut off. So we need to be able to control the sea routes if we're going to have anything to do with that. So we've always had a good Navy since the 50s, really. We learned our lesson in World War II. World War I, we didn't learn our lesson. And then World War II started, and we realized that you can't just stop your military buildup, stop trying to have an effective Navy or Air Force or anything, just have a shadow one and just call them up if there's a war. It just doesn't work that way anymore. It requires too many resources. It's always required too many resources, and it was always dangerous to wait till the last minute to call up your troops. This is why the Roman Empire was so successful for so many hundred years, was because they had a professional army that was in the field for a long time. Remember, some of their enlistment got to where it was 20 years. And so they'd have a legion out along the German border or Syria or you name it. These guys have been fighting and building roads and doing all this kind of stuff for 10 or 15 years. That's what their job was. Professionals. They trained every day. They were kept fairly well supplied. And the empire only started falling apart when people didn't think they needed them anymore. They were very decadent. They felt like we have everything we need. So what? So what if there's problems over there, somewhere around the Black Sea area with some invading Huns or whatever? That's, we can probably take care of that, and we're okay here in the Italian peninsula. No, you weren't. And what's really sad is if you look right at the end there in the 5th century at the way that the Roman army was outfitted versus the way it was 200 years before, or even 150 years before. It doesn't look like the same army. Now, some of that is, of course, because there has been some change in tactics, because as they've moved into some of these areas where a pure legionary kind of tactic, a modular kind of tactic with cohorts and so forth, wasn't as effective. You needed more cavalry. You needed to have some sort of things like that to move quickly, because you were in areas that weren't as amenable to pure infantry action. But what really was happening was they weren't getting any money. They weren't spending any money on defense. They didn't think they needed it anymore. It had been so long since they had people really threaten them that they just let it run down. And when people did threaten them, they just gave up at a few places because, well, it was a long ways away. Let them come across the Danube. Oh, that's okay. That's a long ways away. Well, they just keep coming when you do that. So this is a lesson we learned. So we'll see what happens with this Ukrainian situation. And if we've learned a lesson about trying to keep our military up to where it can do its own job. Remember, its job is to kill people and break things. Sorry to say that to some of the left, but that's the job. The job of the military is to protect, project force, and destroy the will of the enemy to fight. That's it. And if you're not dedicated to that, first of all, then you got a problem. And we got a problem. We'll see how that works out. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about something else too. And that is that I would like to see everybody out there not lose the skill of discourse, let's call it. I don't use conversation, but the Greeks started this with the discourse, with the with the symposium. And this, in other words, what we would do now is some guys get together on Saturday morning, have a coffee and some donuts. Boy, I'd like to have a donut, but anyway, and talk about what's going on in the world. That's sort of a version of that. Sharing ideas. Things go back and forth. Sharing information. Points of view. It sharpens everybody's point of view, and it makes them look at their arguments. Talk things over with your friends. Don't become isolated on your computers or your smartphones. Human interaction. And even if you do this over FaceTime or Zoom, it's still something. You're still interacting. It makes you think. We cannot fall into something where we're just become monasteries of our own minds. And we don't interact enough. We don't challenge our beliefs. We don't, find out what other people are thinking. We don't get a slightly different perspective on what we're doing to think about it. We need to do that. There's a lot to think about out there now, folks. We are in a very sketchy point in history. This is another of those turning points. I know old Joe likes to call it an inflection point. Yeah, well, I'd scream it like he does, but I don't want to. Yeah, it's an inflection point, but I think it's more than that. I mean, if you look at our little theory about the turnings, that you have one turning, two turning, three turning, four turning, that are all essentially changes in generational feelings and approaches, and they just keep repeating over and over again. And you can make a pretty good argument for that we're in a time of systemic change. We're not exactly sure what that change is going to be. We haven't decided yet. But it's not going to be the same as it was 20 years ago. That's probably good, but it can also be bad. History is not necessarily something that moves forward in an improving way. This is something that's very confusing to me, why historians and so forth, well, just politicians, anybody, act as though human progress is just that it's always moving forward. No, it's not. There's plenty of times in history where human advancement didn't advance. It just went sideways. Where what people were doing, the kinds of things they were involved with, the way they lived, the technological advantages that they had, were frozen for not like a decade, but for hundreds of years. So it wasn't exactly like a curve going up. It just flattened out. And to some extent, we've had plenty of periods where it went down. I don't think anybody with a straight face, and there are people who try and make this, can say that someone living in 600 AD, say Britain, is living anywhere near at the level of comfort and knowledge that they were living in 200 AD. Because the Romans had pulled out at this point, left everything there. They'd lost a lot of this knowledge. And people were wandering around looking at old Roman buildings, and like I've said so many times before, not having an idea how to build them. Didn't know how to dress the stone, didn't know how to use pedal cranes and get, the walls up. They had no idea how it was done. And that's a strange feeling, isn't it? Doesn't it feel dystopian? Doesn't it feel sort of like some movie where people are walking around and the skyscrapers and there's nobody in them anymore and things like that? Yeah, that's kind of the way it was. Took a long time to get that back. I have an AI that I designed. I like to fool around with that helps me understand medical terminologies, issues, and diagnosis and stuff like that, because I think it's important to be able to do that. And really no one person can know all this stuff, because it's just like being lawyers. You can be a lawyer and know a little bit about real estate law, but if you work all the time in criminal law, you have pretty limited knowledge after a while about real estate, right? You can answer some questions and sound like you know what you're talking about, and in general you do, but you can't really get into it. So it's the same thing with medicine. I mean, people have their own specialties, and they can sound like they know a little something about the other stuff, and they probably do. But, one thing that AI can do is it can become an expert in a few minutes if you just ask it a question and you've set it up right, and they can give you an answer from experts in that, research papers, things like that. So anyway, but I set that up, and I called it Galen. And the reason I called it Galen was because Galen, and many of you may know this, Galen was a Roman, big surprise, physician who wrote extensively about medical procedures, medicine, ailments, diagnosis, this kind of stuff. And he was rediscovered sort of a little bit before the Renaissance. His writings were, and was incorporated into what became more modern medicine. I'll tell you, medicine is not so hot in Europe in 600, okay? Wasn't as good in Rome. It wasn't as good as it was in Rome in 200. So they just had a lot of lost knowledge. Galen had written this down. A lot of his writings and things were rediscovered, and it really was a big leap forward in terms of medical knowledge. Now, Galen also had gathered a lot of this stuff from the Greeks. If you look at it, the Romans, thought the Greeks were disorganized and problem children because they just could never get their act together, which after Alexander is exactly true. But they understood their knowledge base, and so they collected a lot of knowledge base from them, and then they refined it and sort of solidified it into certain topics. That's what Galen did. But it was lost for a long time. So was Aristotle. And really, St. Thomas Aquinas is the one that pulled Aristotle out of history, started telling people this guy knew what he was talking about. It was at a time when anybody who was a, quote, pagan wasn't to be listened to. Kind of an interesting time. But you guys have to stay out there, and you have to have discourse. You have to talk among yourselves. You have to meet up one way or another, virtually, in person, whatever the case may be. And you need to continue on with your thought process and interacting with people. Because that's the way things get done. And I worry that we're becoming more and more pulled back. We're listening to only one thing. We get irritated and disgusted at some of the things we see. Makes us pull back in and not want to participate. You got to participate with people. It's harder to participate with the other side now because it's become extremely adversarial. And that's too bad. It's always been something people argued about, but now it's, the fight's on from the second you open your mouth. You're on one side or the other, and particularly if you're Republican or a conservative, there's about 2 sentences you can get out, and progressives think that you're walking with the devil. So that's not good for society in any way. And that's why we end up with this strange situation we're in now. People say, well, we should talk more about local issues, and we should. But what I found is I could talk a lot about national issues because there isn't many local issues anymore in the same way. Now, of course, there are local issues. Do you want to build a school? Should we have the roads paved? Stuff like those are really important things. But the problem has become that there's no longer local politics in most instances. there's politics about who gets in the, who's on the game and who gets up, or rather Kamala Harris gets to be Attorney General, that kind of stuff. But what you have now is really, especially if you look for someone that's on the left, you have national policies that are implemented in local elections. It used to be if you were Democrat or Republican, you had kind of a philosophy, but you apply that philosophy to local problems and solutions. Now, if you're a progressive, you apply those solutions whether they work in your area or not. You apply things that they're applying in New York and that aren't even working in your town, because now everybody's in lockstep. So to some extent, it's really hard to have local politics because everyone has identified with a agenda. And that's not good for local politics, because sometimes you have to craft things for where you live. Very destructive. We need to realize that. And we've gotten away from that idea that I have a general philosophical background and this is how I'll approach my job, but I'm also going to realize we're unique. Boy, a lot of solutions you get out of city councils and some of these other governing bodies in states are not unique. They are just reflections of a national policy, whether or not it works nationally, and certainly whether or not it works locally. They don't care. They just think this is what you do. So that's why we talk about a lot of national stuff here, and then you guys have to go out and see what nut jobs we have running for office here and there, and, pick the least damaging one. And that's about as good as we get now. But that's kind of about as good as we get most of the time. Once in a while in history, you get somebody that you chose and turns out to be really good. Also, people turn out really bad. But there is a little bit of tendency towards mediocrity. Anyway, so we are in a surreal situation here right now. Think about this. We have a situation where a presidential candidate is anointed by a party with not one person casting a primary vote for them. Just anointed. Nobody would have thought about that. We got rid of a sitting president, his own party, when they realized he was too much of a liability, by essentially telling him that, if you don't get out, we're going to use the 25th Amendment. Or somebody's going to do something like that. They just ran him out of office. Now, is he capable of being in office? Of course not. But that's okay. He can be president for another 6 months. It's just like Kamala will be vice president for another 6 months. Will she do anything with whatever power she has in that office, or getting Joe to do anything? Do they talk? Do they have anything to do with each other? For any of these policies she sort of vaguely refers to. Is she going to do any of them? No, she's not. So you guys out there, you have to be the front line. See what's going on. Talk among yourselves.
Thanks for
listening. It's very important.
Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickWagnerShow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.